Welcome, everyone. We're very glad to see you all today, this Friday. Thank you very much for joining us. And we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and of course, our amazing speaker, a philosopher, an artist, and a scientist, Stephen Friedman. Also, the New York Times declared him a great philosopher. Thank you very much, Stephen. And today's talk is about philosophy and also friendship. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being here with us today. Thank you all, guys. Please feel free to ask your questions, to give your comments. We'll glad to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Aaliyah. I want to also thank the American Consulate, the U.S. Consulate in Almaty, Consul General Eric Meyer, Tracy, Elmira, Dana, and Aaliyah for facilitating these talks, giving me this opportunity to present philosophical perspectives on a wide range of topics. And in general, these talks are often keyed to major international days of recognition and celebration. This week's talk was inspired by International Best Friends Day. Now, it turns out that when I first saw the designation, I read it as Friends Day. And so I'm really going to be focusing more broadly on friendship, but best friends, friendship, I think they are, for our purposes, somewhat equivalent categories. There are a lot of ways to go about this talk. Normally, when a topic presents itself, quotations arise that I've encountered over the years. I, in general, do not research these talks. I assemble them based upon my thoughts, my experiences, my recollections. In general, when I'm quoting things, I'm quoting from memory. A lot of the things that I've memorized decades ago, and they have stood for me the test of time. So it's not just a matter of my going online and looking up some things that I think might be pertinent or of interest in the context of the week's talk. These are things that have gestated and that have maintained their significance for me and have often grown in significance. For friendship, quotations did not present themselves, from my, my years of reading and study and reflection. The one that perhaps did sort of enter consciousness early on was something by Samuel Johnson, the 18th century English lexicographer, author of the first English dictionary that he did single-handedly. Also a moral philosopher. He was not an academic philosopher, not the type of philosopher that I tend to associate with and that I refer to a great deal, in the talks, not like a philosopher like Wittgenstein or Kierkegaard or Hume, Kant, Aristotle even, but someone who has written or wrote about moral aspects of life, aspects of human behavior and experience. Samuel Johnson, in regard to friendship, made the comment once that friendships must always be kept in good repair. Otherwise, one will find oneself at some point alone. He was somebody in particular that struggled with close relationships, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But other than that, nothing really came to mind in terms of a memorable distillation of the essence of friendship. I did go online, and I'm going to discuss some of the quotations that I actually wrote down, partly to address their deficiencies, why they never rose for me to the level of something that I wanted to preserve, in my active, memory. But I wanted to start with something that actually struck me today that is one avenue of approach, because I wanted to do something a little bit different simply because of the degree to which the readings that I've done have not inspired me in terms of their insight into like the phenomenon of friendship. There was a news story that you might have read about. I actually read it on a British website, The Guardian. So it seems to be making its way around the world. And what struck me in particular was the headline. And just so I give it to you exactly as I read it, because I think the specific form of it matters. Because I saw other headlines that didn't quite have the impact, other headlines related to the story. 2 Utah girls, 9 and 4, stole their parents' car to swim with dolphins in California. Now, the story did not end tragically. These 2 girls, again, 9 and 4, they were sisters, woke up apparently at like 3 in the morning, got the keys to their parents' car, a Chevy Malibu, and began to drive it towards California, 700 miles away. They only made it 10 miles. They crashed, but there were no injuries. So, as I said, it doesn't have a tragic upshot. It might have. Turns out the girls were wearing their seatbelts, and that spared them what could have been a cataclysmic outcome. This is obviously not the kind of behavior or actions to be encouraged. And in bringing it up, that's not the point. I'm bringing it up for a number of reasons. One, I sent the link to that story to a friend of mine, actually to a few friends, but a lot of my friends are in different parts of the world. And so I didn't hear back immediately, except from one person that is in California, in Los Angeles. She was my former acting coach when I did the play in New York. I sent her the link to the article, and I made a comment, "Best story ever?" ? And she responded in emphatic agreement. Really? Now, again, it didn't end tragically, and it's not behavior that one wants to see on the part of a 9-year-old or a 4-year-old. But and a key to what was captivating about it, I think, was that line, "to swim with dolphins." It had one might almost call it sort of a romantic aspect, in the sense of an unboundedness, like an adventure of an epic stature. Now, one point that I wanted to make is my friend Laura's response, her recognizing what it was about the story that had an impact on me, a particular impact that she shared, is central to my friendship with her. And it's almost enough that singular moments or exchanges like that are in fact shared. Now, she shares other characteristics of mine. In particular, and this is something that I want to address as well, she's an introvert. I'm an introvert. I talk a lot, partly so that I don't have to deal with the social exchange, of social relationships. But fundamentally, I derive my energy from, well, being by myself, right? I have to be by myself to generate thoughts. And that's seemingly my main occupation, you know, in this world. Um, I, I like to be focused on a small number of relationships, in intense relationships, strong relationships. That seems to be often a characteristic of the introvert personality. The extrovert tends to seek a broader array of experiences and experiences with a greater diversity and number of individuals. Introverts tend to be more focused on a small number of relationships. And in fact, one of the characteristics of at least my sort of friendships is that not only is there a relatively small number of them by choice, but when I am with a given friend, that person has my singular focus. It's as if every friend I am with, when I am with that person, is my best friend. And it's not, and that's not a misrepresentation. That is actually how the experience feels and how I engage in that relationship. It's something that I'll explore in a little bit in some of these quotations that I mentioned that I wanted to discuss, that I looked up. And that, I don't know, when I was talking about the Leningrad Symphony a few weeks ago, and I think on an earlier occasion, I had quoted Lucian Foss, Lucian Price, a musicologist from the mid-20th century, who had spoken about an encounter he had with Sibelius, the Finnish composer, during World War II, where they were discussing, the desperate circumstances, that the world was dealing with at that time. Now, I'm going to re-quote that just because it captures something that I want to be focusing on, in discussing friendship. At some point in this conversation that Lucian Price was having with Sibelius, Sibelius stopped speaking and began humming a trio of Beethoven's. And Price went on to write that what he thought was that knowing and loving that trio of Beethoven's and having composed perhaps his great music himself, Sibelius too must know, and far better than you or I, that although the world is no great shakes, the future problematical, and no telling what may become of us, so long as there is such music in the world, there is always something we can do about the worst the world can do to us. For eternal life is not a duration, it is an intensity. And that's the key to my sense of the ultimate value of the kinds of associations that we engage in, the kinds of friendships, whether they're friendships that are circumscribed in some way. Let's say they're not part of a romantic relationship, but there is still that extremity of intensity that, for me, justifies the encounter, the engagement, the association. Anything short of that is not really engaging to me. And I think that coheres with the general orientation of philosophy, that philosophy deals with extremities, right? An extreme response to the problems of human life. When I talk about epistemic space, I'm talking about a limited space in which no concepts arise in which human problems resolve in the way that they resolve in Christian terms, in mystical union with God, in Buddhist terms, in enlightenment, in the recognition of the identity of nirvana with samsara, with the world of change around us. So philosophy, in my practice of it and in my sense of its fundamental nature, is operating at an extreme in the way that religions operate at extremes. Kierkegaard, the great Danish philosopher of the early 19th century, stressed that Christianity is a radical cure. And like every radical cure, one puts it off as long as possible. Well, philosophy is not something that I see the need to put off. I see it as something that can be embraced here and now simply by embracing the nature of rigor at its limit. And that embrace is a matter of embracing difference, right? That any two objects are approximately the same, rigorously different. That a philosophic space, what I call an epistemic space, a rigorous space, is defined by difference, by any 2 points differing in some way, or we would not call them two and not one. And it's that difference that undercuts the possibility existentially of a rigorously controlled experiment. It's that difference that means that all of the propositions, all of the speculations, the representations of science are not rigorously supportable. They are not things that we need to feel imprisoned by, that we need to feel shackled by, that ultimately the operation of philosophy is to achieve a radical freedom, a freedom from any type of constraint that, in general, past experience tends to impose upon our sense of the present and our expectation for the future. So extremity is how it's the extremity of intensity, is what characterizes the philosophic enterprise, philosophic understanding, the kind of understanding that, as we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, achieves in rigorous terms what Buddhism aspires to as enlightenment. But enlightenment is a religious term. Philosophy doesn't use such a term except to help explain it. And it explains it through rigor. And rigor is best communicated by that line from King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, where Kent, King's counselor, says to Lear, "I'll teach you differences." And that's the enterprise of philosophy, to teach those differences that are the basis for existence itself, that every object exists in difference from everything else, and to come to an appreciation of what those differences signify. One of the ways that I've often summarized this is by saying that the source of human suffering is the belief that we can see the world from outside. The solution to the problem of human suffering lies in the fact that if you look around, the world is different in different directions. And that's the type of difference that liberates us from the expectations that past experience will foster in the human mind. Because the human mind is really a device of simplification, a device that overlooks these radical distinctions and differences for the purpose of facilitating survival. Salvation lies in the opposite direction. Survival is facilitated by approximate similarities, salvation by rigorous difference. Okay, another story that I wanted to comment on in relation to the issue of friendship and the features that can form the basis of that type of attachment is this situation with Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, the Japanese-American tennis player. She was born in Japan, grew up in the United States, resides in the United States, but in general represents Japan. She is the second highest ranking female tennis player in the world, and the highest earning female athlete in the world right now. She famously, this past week, withdrew from the French Open. She didn't want to do press conferences. She found them uncomfortable. She found them difficult. And she explained, the difficulty that she had in I think, a post that she placed on Instagram. She talked about how she was an introvert and not a natural public speaker. And as an introvert and not being a natural public speaker, it was an ongoing challenge to have to address a room of press, a room of reporters, asking questions, probing into her, the psychology of her performance, let's say, on the court. She was threatened when she announced that she wouldn't be holding press conferences after her matches during the French Open. She was threatened with fines. As the highest earning female athlete in the world, a fine of $15,000 or $20,000, wouldn't signify much. Someone who last year earned over $55 million in endorsements and in winnings. So she was content to pay the fines and desist from those press conferences in order to preserve her peace of mind and her focus during the matches. Well, the representatives of the French Open, the organizing committee, responded by further threats. They said that that not only will she be facing fines, but she may be facing suspension, and not just from the French Open, but from other Grand Slam tennis tournaments. And Naomi Osaka's response to that was to withdraw from the French Open. Bye. Okay. If you're going to threaten me, I am going not to participate in your tournament. Now, the reason I bring that up is partly because I had a similar experience when I was in medical school. For various reasons, and I won't go into all the details. At some other time, I could, when it's maybe more germane to some other topic. I was interested in gaining some accommodation from the deans of the medical school, which they had previously indicated they might be open to because they saw me as unusual and they had a high regard, for my abilities. Okay. But at some point, they threatened and said, well, no, if you don't do it this way, then there will be consequences. And no more than Naomi Osaka, I don't respond. I don't think human beings need to respond, to threats of any type. And I left. I quit. So the point of that is that similarity, fact that Naomi Osaka is an introvert, not a natural public speaker, and will not respond to threats by seeking accommodation, but by going in a different direction. That's enough. When I saw that, when I encountered that story, that is a person that could be friends. That would be enough for me to be friends with her. If we were ever to meet, that could be a sufficient basis. Doesn't take a lot. Now, we live in a world where there are over 8 billion people. There are lots of opportunities for encountering people, for cultivating friendships. And people tend to be fairly picky and choosy, right? About who they establish friendships with. But the simple fact is, we are capable of establishing friendships with any human being, if we are so inclined, if we have the will. That friendship is ultimately conditioned by similarity. I've been sort of revealing some similarities between me and some individuals that either I am friends with or I feel like I could be friends with. And that's the fundamental dynamic that is controlling ultimately for friendships. But there are always enough similarities between any two human beings so that a friendship can be cultivated. It just depends upon the circumstances that will engage the will. I mean, and this has been noted repeatedly, right, throughout literature, throughout history, if one were to find oneself on an island with another human being, one could establish a friendship. The fact that we are two human beings presents enough similarities, but it even goes beyond that. We can establish friendships because of enough similarities between ourselves and animals. Right? That it's been said famously over and over again that the dog, is a human being's best friend. People have close and abiding associations with dogs, with animals. I mean, there's a show, a reality show, about a zoo in England, apparently one of the leading zoos in England. The title of the show, at least in this country, is The Secret Life of the Zoo. And it focuses upon handlers of animals at this zoo, when the public is not present after hours. It's a behind the scenes look at how animal handlers engage with the animals that are in their care. They all develop close associations with these animals. They all develop what might be said to rise to the level of friendship. Now, obviously, it's not going to be characterized by the type of exchanges that we have with other human beings, but that's not quite necessary for an intensity of an association. And what's remarkable, and friends of mine that I've recommended the show to have commented upon this when we talked about it after they've seen some of the episodes. What's remarkable is that relationships are established, significant relationships between the animal handlers and every category of animal that they're in charge of, including insects. There are handlers that are in charge of various species of insects. Well, they are able to discriminate among insects and discern differences in personality and in behavior. Again, I'm not suggesting that, this is, rising to the full level of exchange, obviously, of friendships with human beings, but it is significant in terms of what we are capable of establishing relationships, significant emotional relationships that have all types of emotional benefits with. It extends even to inanimate objects. In the sense, there's a famous Hollywood film um, starring Tom Hanks, a leading Hollywood actor, in which the film is called Castaway. And Tom Hanks establishes a relationship that saves his life with a volleyball. Now, again, I'm not presenting this, to sort of suggest that, those associations are what we have in mind in the celebration of Best Friends Day. But what I am suggesting is our capacity to develop strong emotional attachments with anything. Because there's always, and this is something that philosophy is especially sensitive to, there is at some level of generality significant degrees of commonality, even with at the level of objects, right, being existent things. And if it seems that we shouldn't be putting like an object like a volleyball in this category, well, if we look at the history of various religious traditions, we see the degree to which, God will be seen as manifesting himself or herself or itself in objects. And the founding fathers of the United States were deists by and large. Deism was a form of religiosity in which God was seen as being everywhere, manifesting himself, herself, itself in everything. And I've talked about how every object can be seen as a universal convergent, right? That every object can be said to summarize the universe at that point. That mathematically, every element in the universe can be mapped to a given object. And because we can't remove that object from the world and see how the world would be without it, we can't rewind in time to compare the world at a given time, at a given moment, with the object, without the object. If we destroy the object, well, it's not at an equivalent moment. Everything is now different, or enough things are different, that the comparison is not equivalent. So, the God in the Old Testament manifests himself, herself, itself in a burning bush. So, and part of the significance of what I'm getting at here is it's a matter of will, it's a matter of engagement, and it's the type of capability that human beings have that supports, for example, arranged marriages. Why arranged marriages, when they've been studied, seem to produce as much or more happiness as marriages that come about through, through love, through, like random encounters where you happen to, meet somebody that you feel especially drawn to. Something that's not arranged for reasons of, well, often they're arranged at the highest levels of society. Often they're arranged for reasons of empire. And these types of relationships where you have to commit for one reason or another, or the cultural tradition is accepting, is encouraging, is demanding, it certainly expecting that type of commitment to a person that you might not have met prior to the marriage. Well, it's possible for those relationships to flourish, and they typically do flourish because we are capable of establishing a relationship with anybody. There is enough commonality between any two human beings. It's a matter of our focus and our intensity, our commitment to that engagement. Now, in this regard, now that we're talking about the intensity of commitment that can support a friendship, right? And again, that friendship can arise with someone that you are forcibly conjoined with in a prison, under any set of circumstances. As long as we're talking about that intensity, one of the things that did come to mind when, again, the topic of friendship presented itself was an early sutra, hymn, poem from the Buddhist tradition. The early Buddhist tradition was called the Theravadan Buddhist tradition. That's the tradition that recognizes the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, as having been not a god of some type, but a human being who was interested in solving the problem of human life from where he stood and where it presented itself. The poem is called Fair Lonely as Rhinoceros. It's somewhat lengthy. I just wanted to read a few of the early stanzas of it to give you a sense of the Buddhist attitude towards friendship. And it's a little bit atypical of what's normally represented and celebrated in more like Western cultures. Here it is. And it goes like this. So again, the title is Fair Lonely as Rhinoceros. Put by the rod for all that lives, nor harm thou any one thereof. Long not for son, how then for friend? Fair lonely as rhinoceros. Love cometh from companionship. In wake of love, upsurges ill. Seeing the bane that comes of love, fair lonely as rhinoceros. In ruth for all his bosom friends, a man heart-chained rejects the goal, neglects the goal. Seeing this fear in fellowship, fair lonely as rhinoceros. Buddhism is a religious tradition focused on a complete solution to the problem of human life. Notice, it's been said that the genius of Christianity is to have emphasized that the path to the deepest mystery is the path of love. And we hear God is love, love is all you need in the famous Beatles song. Love is celebrated within the Christian tradition in particular. Not in the Buddhist tradition. The Buddhist tradition celebrates compassion. But ultimate salvation in the Buddhist tradition is not a matter of love for God or even fully love for one's fellow man. It's a matter of understanding the nature of this experience and then displaying compassion towards those who are still ensnared in this world of suffering, that the only way out of is the Buddhist path of understanding. There's an emphasis here on solitude, right? Not engaging. In fact, it points out that friendship is not an answer. Love is not an answer. The answer is in the opposite direction. It's actually a position that more conforms with the philosophic perspective, right? Where salvation is singular. It's based upon the uniqueness of our circumstance, what distinguishes us from everything else, that is the ultimate ground of existence and the ultimate liberation from the shackles that our thoughts, our expectations, the approximations that the mind makes, processes in relation to experience, imposes upon us, traps us in. They have an aphorism, we wallpaper the future with prints from the past. We then marvel at our dissatisfactions. So Buddhism is interested in freedom, freedom from the wheel, right? Not, and that freedom includes freedom that's absolute, freedom from everything, every mode of attachment, even attachment to others. Fair lonely as rhinoceros is an early form representing a mode of Buddhist salvation. Right? It's something that we see in unexpected places, in authors and in historical figures that are celebrated in Western culture. Some of these I've referred to before. Anne Frank, notably, I mean, she's often celebrated for her humanity, for her enduring spirit, her sense of optimism in the face of the most horrific set of circumstances, and she's seen as an engaging personality. But Anne Frank famously commented that she would be able to achieve, she thought, what she was aspiring to if there were no other people in the world. Mother Teresa, and this intersects a little bit of what Buddhism embraces, stressed that it was always and only between her and God, that all of the compassion, all of the works of love that characterized her life, her vocation, and for which she's celebrated, is not quite the point for her. The point for her was the relationship with God, and all of those acts of compassion were a token of that fundamental relationship. It was always between her and God. One encounters actually a similar outlook in Gandhi. Gandhi, again, is seen as someone socially engaged, politically engaged. He was one of the principal instruments for the achievement of Indian independence from British Empire, British rule. Famously commented, my devotion to my people is part of the discipline I impose upon myself to liberate my soul. But again, it was a matter of achieving salvation And the salvation was not represented by his relationship with his people, his working for others, his relationship with others. His relationship with others represented a discipline that was only a means to a deeper end, the end of ultimate liberation from the entire human enterprise. Again, it's escape the wheel, right? The wheel of birth and rebirth. That's a theme of the highest aspirations of Hindu religious thought. So again, friendship can be embraced, and in Western cultures is often seen as a fundamental fulfillment of our humanity and our relations with others. But it's not universally so. It's not so in Buddhism, and it's not quite so in philosophy. And to emphasize the philosophical point, let's make sure we're doing well, we're doing fine. Remember this basic representation. H stands for heuristic space, where that's where equality between two things is possible. Any two things are approximately the same for some purpose. Epistemic space, philosophic space, is a rigorously distinct space where it's a difference space. It's defined by difference. And I've often summarized this by saying, imagine 2 points, 2 mathematical points, no properties. And if you like, imagine them as the only 2 things in all the world, in all of existence. What those 2 mathematical points have in common forms a heuristic space. How they differ forms an epistemic space. A heuristic space is the space of our language that groups things, clusters things. It's a convergent space, brings things together. An epistemic space is a divergent space, a space, again, characterized by difference. Now, when we talk about friendship, what are we imagining fundamentally in terms of those categories? We're talking about things coming together, right? We're talking about 2 people coming together. We're talking about a convergence. So we're talking about something that operates within heuristic space, not epistemic space. So philosophically, we are talking about something that does not conduce to, is not in the nature of salvation. That friendship is helpful, right? It helps us deal with life. It helps us cope with life. It helps us enjoy life. It helps facilitate ends of survival, right? As individuals and as groups. But again, salvation, the opposite direction. We see a little of how that plays itself out in this film that also came to mind when the topic presented itself, for obvious reasons, Seeking a Friend for the End of the World. It's a sort of a comedy, really, a romantic comedy. Stars Keira Knightley and Steve Carell. I don't know how well known they are everywhere, but they're they're highly, established actors, like in the English-speaking world. So it's a romantic comedy based on the premise that an asteroid is heading to Earth and is going to collide. It can't be stopped, and it's going to destroy the world and end the Earth and human life as we not as just as we know it. It's an extinction event. And the film, is engaged in a countdown to that end. And as the film is counting down, these two characters meet and form a relationship, a bond, right? That helps them cope with the cataclysm that's coming. And and they develop a friendship and more, like a romantic friendship, right? And by the way, the difference between friendship and a romantic friendship is a question of boundaries, right? That the essence of the romantic is that it is unbounded, that it can go as far as a human relationship can. It can go as far as a lifetime commitment of having children, of being a family. It is the least bounded of any human relationship in principle. That's the nature of the term romantic. It is fundamentally about the unbounded. So these two characters, meet and they engage, and they finally sort of are together as the moment of extinction approaches. But within seconds of that event, Keira Knightley is afraid. She's scared. And she tells that to the Steve Carell character. It's helpful having a friend in those circumstances, but not quite helpful enough. Certainly not in terms of the help that religions aspire to provide and that philosophy sees itself as being able to offer. Right? Do not suffer that it ends. It was not redemption. We fear death as if we understood life. Right? So the philosophic response is stronger than the type of consolation that human relationships provide, even at their most intense, their most extreme, their most committed. And that film is something of a testament to that circumstance. Let's see who we have. Yeah. Okay, now we have some time, right? We're okay?
Yeah, we do have a little, but previously we were asked a lot of questions from our amazing audience.
Okay, I want to deal with the questions, and I will deal with the questions. Let me see. Here, okay. I will maybe do another 10 minutes or so, and then we'll get to the questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure. Thank you.
Now I mentioned. Let me just say this. Historically, and this can be for people to pursue if they're interested. The most important philosopher that wrote on friendship in a very celebrated set of pages from what's called the Nicomachean Ethics was Aristotle. Books, it's 8 and 9 of his Ethics deal specifically with friendship. It's in this discussion that Aristotle famously offers, he asked rhetorically the question, what is a friend? It is a single soul in two bodies. Okay? Again, it's a poetic way, really, of emphasizing the degree of commonality, of similarity, of engagement, that these two individuals may have in the relationship. It's actually an expression that has its roots in Plato. In Plato's Symposium, he's talking about love, and one of the myths that he puts forth to explain the nature of like romantic love, that extreme sort of engagement of two people, is that early on, the beginning of time, beginning of the creation of the human race, human beings were more physically powerful than they are now. They had 4 arms and 4 legs. And they were so powerful that the gods felt threatened. They were worried that human capabilities might challenge their own, the powers of the gods. And so to ensure that their position, in the world would not be threatened by human beings, the gods sort of cleaved human beings in half. We, with 2 arms and 2 legs, are the result of that cleavage, and we are searching for our other half, right? That is our soulmate, right? That's the Aristotelian idea of friends as well, that they are soulmates based upon, again, a degree of commonality and really commitment. But Aristotle also likes to categorize things. He talks about 3 different types of friendship: friendship of utility, usefulness; friendship that serves pleasure. It's pleasurable to be with another person, a certain type, at a certain stage in your life, maybe. And then this more committed friendship of 2 people who are soulmates, 2 souls in one body. I mean, 1 soul in 2 bodies, sorry. Notice characterization. When we're talking about clustering, categorizing things, we are operating within heuristic space, right? We're doing a heuristic enterprise. Aristotle was really half philosopher, half scientist. And his philosophy, insofar as he's making distinctions among different types of categories of things, he's displaying a philosophic spirit. Insofar as he's clustering things together based upon approximate similarities, he's engaging in something closer to science. Even though Aristotle has a first-rate mind, like one of the great minds in human history, a lot of the exercise of that mind is not what we might, or what I might recognize as purely like philosophic. In the way, for example, that Wittgenstein apparently did not embrace Aristotle. I didn't know this when I formed my views of Aristotle, but Wittgenstein as a philosophical mind is purer and deeper and stronger than Aristotle, who again straddles 2 worlds: the world of the sciences, the world of philosophy, and that's seen in terms of his propensity to categorize. Montaigne, a 16th century French philosopher, writer, inspired by Aristotle, but even more by Plato. Oh, I'm sorry, by Plato, but Socrates through Plato. Montaigne famously had a medallion that he always wore, Cassasia. What do I know? Again, inspired by Socrates as he has come down to us through Plato's writings. Montaigne sort of embraces in his writing on friendship this concept of like the soulmate concept, where a friend would do anything for another, for one's friend, anything. Francis Bacon, the English philosopher, diplomat, legal mind, who is often seen as a candidate for having written Shakespeare's plays if Shakespeare didn't write them. The Bacon theory of the origin of Shakespeare, I think, doesn't hold up very well when you examine the nature of Shakespeare's writing, the sound of his language, compared to the sound of Bacon's writing. They're very distinct. The rhythms, they're both great minds. Bacon had a very powerful intelligence. That's often why I think, and a great deal of learning. So it's believed, people think that, well, he had enough learning, enough intelligence to have written something that someone of Shakespeare's more limited educational experience couldn't have done. But as I said, it really doesn't hold up to the analysis based on the sound. And English is primarily a language constructed and written in terms of its sounds and sound patterns. Bacon wrote about friendship. He also makes distinctions categories. So those are three people to look at for a more traditional philosophical perspective, or at least how three famous philosophers wrote about friendship. But I wanted to read a couple of things before I get to the questions. I think we still have time. One person that I respect philosophically, and actually sometimes have been compared to, is Albert Camus, the French existentialist, novelist, and philosopher. The first major work that I read in philosophy was Alfred North Whitehead's Science in the Modern World. The second major work I read was Camus' Myth of Sisyphus. And as I said, I have a great admiration for Camus' writing. And he was the first author that I read effectively complete. I read all of his works because I was that drawn to his style and his sensibility. Well, I found this quotation by Camus on friendship. Quote, "Don't walk in front of me. I may not follow. Don't walk behind me. I may not lead. Walk beside me. Just be my friend." Well, it's kind of tepid, right? Again, these are the kinds of quotations that do not, for me, rise to a level of profound insight, into like friendship. That, again, the distinction between the epistemic and the heuristic, that friendship represents a convergent process, and as such, it operates in heuristic space. So it has utility, it has value, it even has survival value, but does not save us. C.S. Lewis, another celebrated writer that I don't so much embrace, haven't so much historic in my own reading, wrote, "Friendship is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things that give value to survival." Well, there are lots of issues with that, right? That the notion that, like philosophy, not necessary. Einstein did not feel that philosophy had no survival value. Einstein's application of philosophy to physics, basically his working out in one direction the physics of existentialism, of the circumstance that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside, led ultimately to E equals mc squared, which was decisive in the Allied victory, at least in the Pacific, right? Led to the atomic bomb. So I think C.S. In general, I find that many people don't have, no matter how celebrated they might be, their writing might be, and how admired and how admirable, they often, from my perspective, don't have a really clear and cogent sense of what philosophy is doing and is aiming to do. That notion of philosophy as operating at the limit of rigor. Philosophy helped engineer. It's the fundamental instrument behind the scientific method. So philosophy is capable of much more than C.S. Lewis imagines here. Jane Austen, though, says something that does comport with what I was saying at the beginning. The English writer, Jane Austen, English novelist, the early 19th century, there is nothing I would not do for those who are really my friends. I have no notion of loving people by halves. It is not my nature. And again, this agrees with that sense that I was developing about the intensity that is ultimately redemptive, the intensity that characterizes my relationship to friendship and that can characterize these relationships if we are committed to them, if we honor them sufficiently. The notion that when I am with a friend, that person is my best friend. That person is my focus. A similar point is made by Napoleon, that Napoleon wrote that he would only entertain relationships where he was the dominant affection. Now, there's something egotistical about that. Napoleon wanted to be the most important person in anyone's life that happened to be engaging with him. But again, one doesn't have to be egotistic, have that Napoleonic view fully. For one can have rather what I've been developing, the notion that when I am with somebody, my focus is singular, on that person. They are my best friend, or I'm wasting my time, right? Our time is too valuable. So if I'm going to be with somebody when I'm with that person, my commitment is complete. And yet those, I think, okay. The final thing before I go to the questions, we'll go back. I want to recite one little paragraph by the American philosopher, Ralph Waldo Emerson, on our circumstance. And then I will address the questions. So let me just read this. It's a paragraph. It actually concludes one of his essays. I think the essay is called Illusions. And it goes like this. And it's a parable. Okay? Every god is there sitting in his sphere. The young mortal enters the hall of the firmament. There is he alone with them alone, they pouring on him benedictions and gifts, and beckoning him up to their thrones. On the instant and incessantly fall snowstorms of illusions. He fancies himself in a vast crowd which sways this way and that, and whose movement and doings he must obey. He fancies himself poor, orphaned, insignificant. The mad crowd drives hither and thither, now furiously commanding this thing to be done, now that. What is he that he should resist their will and act or think for himself? Every moment, new changes and new showers of deceptions to baffle and distract him. And when, by and by, for an instant, the air clears and the cloud lifts a little, there are the gods still sitting around him on their thrones, they alone, with him alone. It's a parable that we see in other traditions. In the Hindu tradition, it takes various form. The idea that salvation is singular and that our friends, our relationships, our convergences can help us in a myriad of ways, can help us survive. But in terms of salvation, salvation is rigorous, is the limit of rigor. And the limit of rigor is a singularity. Okay, so I think that's a reasonable point to stop this discussion of friendship for now. As always, there's more that can be said. There are more anecdotes I could explore, but I think that gives a reasonable sort of representation of the philosophic response. Okay. Now, questions from last time, we had a lot, and let me address them now. Okay. Okay, first question. I quoted something last time from the books of Joshua about Galileo, right? Galileo claimed too much, as did the church, which likes to fuss, as did Galileo, right? And we know that Galileo was a 17th century Italian astronomer, physicist, one of the important figures in the dawn of modern science and astronomy. He argued strongly for the Copernican view of the world, of the solar system, that the sun, not the earth, was the center, and the earth was revolving, was in motion around the sun. And that brought him into conflict with the teachings that the church embraced, and he was called to the Vatican, and he was forced to recant, his scientific speculations and writings. And he did. And he was sentenced to house arrest, where I think he spent the last 10 years or so of his life, blind because of having studied the sun with his telescope. So the question is, there was a court session where Galileo officially rejected his vision, his views, his scientific views, supporting the Copernican view of the solar system. But he didn't reject it in his mind. So what do you think? Okay, yes. In fact, when I was in high school, I had on my notebook that I just carried around with me the words that he uttered, after he was forced to sign that recantation. And the words, the Italian is, and I'm not sure quite how to pronounce Italian, but e pur si muove. And yet it moves. Yes, so Galileo, to himself, embraced the Copernican view to the end, right? Galileo's often been criticized for not being more public, in his embrace of that view to the end. So while Galileo has gone down as a great figure in science, a great Renaissance man, actually, he was multi-talented. He did work in a variety of different directions. He's not seen as a great moral exemplar, right? Because he did recant and views that he knew he felt to be wrong, right? He felt that recantation was wrong. Of course, as we see now from the Einsteinian perspective, Galileo was a little bit too dogmatic, right? He was as dogmatic in his way as the church was in its. And the issue of, what is the stationary, what is revolving around what, can't be answered except from outside the world, which is not a place we can go to. The point of Einstein's work is that any point where we find ourselves can be considered the still point of existence, and everything else can be represented in motion relative to that point of fixity. That is the point, the essence of existentialism, of not being able to remove ourselves from the world and see it from the outside. The scientific vision typically is doing that, or is attempting to do that. Most scientists are imagining an objective reality as if they were seeing the world from that exterior position. But the strongest scientific results, relativity theory, quantum mechanics, take the perspective of that existentialist point of view, where we have to describe our circumstances from where we are. Okay. Next. Love conjures the light, I agree. What about duty and friendship? Okay, well, I've talked about friendship, for, the last hour and more. So I think I'll let that stand, right, as that, for that. Duty also operates within, so again, friendship, love operate within a heuristic space because they are convergent functions. They are a matter of bringing things together. Salvation, rigor, philosophy is a matter of recognizing the distinctions. The question of duty pertains partly to social imperatives, the degree to which we embrace a sense of social obligation to others. Ultimately, one has to decide, again, philosophically, what one conceives of as one's fundamental duty to one's life, to the world. For me, I was in medicine, but that was not my calling. I felt that my calling was philosophy. I knew that I was going to ultimately do philosophy. I was only going to do medicine for a period of time until philosophy called me back, and I knew that it would. My duty is to philosophy, to what I see as my philosophical abilities. So one has to decide ultimately oneself, what one's duty is, to one's life, to one's circumstances. It relates to a question a little bit further down about one's mission. I tell people one's ultimate duty is to save the world, but one saves the world that presents itself to one. So again, one can't leave the world to view it from the outside. One judges and decides based upon where one is and responds to the needs of circumstance as those needs arise, present themselves. I see one's duty and one's calling as highly individualistic functions because they are contingent upon one's nature, one's circumstances, one's life experience, and again, everyone's circumstances are distinct, are unique. Even two people that are brought up in the same household, in the same environment, are not experiencing exactly the same world, exactly the same existence. And so it's often said, well, in one family, one child becomes a physician, a healer, the other becomes a murderer. If they're brought up in the same environment, it must be a difference in character. No, they weren't brought up in the same environment. Any difference in environment, in background, in experience, may be the decisive difference in producing a different outcome. Okay? And you can't do the experiment to determine what the actual way to view that situation is. You can't go back in time, manipulate circumstances, and see if changing circumstances produces a change in outcome, or if changing circumstances does not. And so it's the nature of the individual that's decisive. The experiment cannot, in principle, be done. Okay, let's see. Next. And remember what Goethe said about duty that I like to quote. If you would be happy, you must do your duty. And what is your duty? The demand of the hour, as it presents itself to you in your circumstances. Have you ever read Arthur Schopenhauer's works? If yes, what is your favorite and why? Yes, I read Schopenhauer when I was young, actually. A long time ago. I haven't revisited him. I tend not to revisit people that I read when I was young, often because it's hard for me to reread them, because I'll read the opening paragraph of their work and issues, limitations, problems with their perspective will present themselves to me. So, and I also, in the case of certain authors like Wittgenstein that I have a high regard for, I don't want to be disappointed in a revisiting of their work. So, but Schopenhauer I read when I was young, maybe around 15 or so. His two major works, I think, I guess we can say, are The World as Will and Representation. That's his magnum opus. That's his major work. And I liked it. I liked his style. I was reading it in translation, in English translation, and I always hesitate to judge too much. His later work that was published at the end of his life and actually was responsible for his fame, were two collections of essays, more aphoristic writings, that I actually was a little bit drawn more to because of the nature of their style. You know, I'm an aphoristic writer, and so I'm drawn to other authors that, you know, are exploring that same literary approach. The title of these later collections of essays are somewhat pretentious. They're from the Greek. They mean appendices and omissions. In Greek, it's parerga and paralipomenia, or lipomena. You have to, if you look up Arthur Schopenhauer online, you'll see it's two P's, okay? I'm, again, drawn somewhat to those, but I'm also drawn to some of the biographical circumstances, actually, of Schopenhauer's life. He didn't so much have a fully attractive personality or lifestyle. One of the most noteworthy things about him that he shares with a lot of other philosophers, myself included, is he had a phobia for noise, for ambient sounds. They would drive him crazy. It was true for Nietzsche. It was true for Wittgenstein. It's true for me. It was true for Schopenhauer. His father was a businessman. He inherited money from his father that was his means of support. He occupied a 2-room apartment in Vienna, I think it was. But his apartment abutted the kitchen, of a neighbor. A woman, I think an elderly woman, lived in this apartment, and she would, be in her kitchen, making noise with pots and pans that drove Schopenhauer crazy. And one day he pushed her down the flight of stairs leading to her apartment. Charges were brought. He almost lost his fortune. The woman did not lose her life, but it's a reflection on something about Schopenhauer's character. Um, Beyond that, I think it's noteworthy that Schopenhauer lived mostly in philosophical obscurity until those collections of essays were published, towards the end of his life. Um, his philosophy is pessimistic. It's highly influenced by Eastern thought, Buddhism, Hinduism, um, uh, seeing the world as a veil of suffering that were better left behind. And I think he famously advocated for the human race to cease reproduction for a generation, that if the human race could do so, we could bring the human race to an end, and that would be better for all. So, but his popularity partly was possible in the post-Napoleonic War era, when after the destruction of the Napoleonic Wars, people were drawn to a more like pessimistic outlook. Okay. Schopenhauer. In some cases, parents can't see modern changes in the world, and mostly they wouldn't like to accept it. What do you think about this? This is ancient. It's an ancient issue, an ancient complaint. Socrates famously complained about the wayward ways of youth in Athens. The more things change, the more one generation will feel that the next generation will have issues with the next generation, especially in terms of taste, musical taste and cultural sort of responses. But I ultimately go back to the French proverb: the more things change, the more they stay the same. So it is a natural phenomenon that we see throughout history, but it's something that need not be so if we just have a perspective on it. Again, more things change, the more things change, the more they stay the same. In that, yes, we have cell phones now, but people have had modes of communication for a long time. We have electric lights. People had candlelight and fire, for millennia. So again, there are more commonalities if one wants to sort of deal with a heuristic space than we sometimes recognize. Okay, and what is your mission in life? Well, what I recommend to everyone is save the world, right? But save it in a way that corresponds to one's ability, outlook, perspective. For me, I was inspired by the words that Einstein wrote when he was a young boy of 11. He wanted to solve the riddle of the great big world. That's been my ambition too. Einstein was mostly exploring that in terms of physics, theoretical physics. I was involved with theoretical physics for a time, but for me, ultimately, philosophy, I feel, is the key to that type of solution. And now my mission is to communicate these results, to give talks like this, to do that play that I did in New York, to write, to make sure my writings are preserved, but as best as I can to explain my work, my results, and because often my writings are concentrated, they're aphoristic, and are not as accessible as I think my explanations might be. But again, everyone saves the world based upon what they recognize the need to be. So I don't universalize mission. And finally, when did philosophy acquire its popularity? When did people realize that philosophy was able to help people? In some cases, I suppose it was in ancient Athens. Am I wrong? Yes. We see ancient Athens as being the birthplace of Western philosophy. It was really the pre-Socratics, Heraclitus, Thales, and Socrates, that showed the potential power of the subject. Philosophy created scientific methodology. It displayed its power, its vitality in that way. And in my work, philosophy at the limit of rigor, I stress is capable of achieving rigorously what religions have aspired to metaphorically. So I see philosophy as the most powerful of human instruments and is capable of helping us in every possible direction, both by articulating the nature of epistemic space of exploring the limits of rigor, and then clarifying everything else that's less than rigorous, and developing, as I've done, convergence theory, which shows how to operate within spaces that are non-rigorous to achieve, for example, results in everything from molecular biology to film marketing to product design. So a lot of applications that I've made of both philosophy and of the non-philosophic space governed by convergence theory. Okay, those are the questions from last time. I think that takes us to the end of our time. So if we have more questions, I'll have to deal with those next time, right? And I see Aaliyah has rejoined.
Yeah, I'm here. Super. One more time, thank you very much, Steven, for being here with us weekly on Fridays. Thank you. We really appreciate our talks and the experience that we're getting. And today we have got a few comments. Good morning. Good to see you. It's also a very active guest that joins us weekly. Thank you for joining us today as well. And the same comment from him. When I listen to you, Mr. Friedman, I subconsciously improve my English. Therefore, thank you.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Yes. See, there are lots of benefits to joining in our talks. Yes.
Thank you very much. And another one. That's probably the question that we're going to address next week. Some American philosophers, such as Theodore Roosevelt, said that even though we were born humans in biological point of view, it's essential to uncover your talents and to become a real human. Do you agree? Thank you very much. One more time, thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us today. And one more time, thank you, the audience, for your comments, for your feedback and likes. We really appreciate them. We will keep the questions for the next week. We'll definitely address them. Stay safe and have a great week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, I hope to see you next week. Thank you so much.